Okay. Sorry it's dark for you. All right, so we talked about yesterday the types of evidence for evolution. I think we talked about the fossil record, and anatomical structures, embryology, and there's also the evidence in the form of the molecular record, and that's becoming more and more common to use now because we can run the genomes in their entirety for any species that we want to now. So what this comparison is you can compare the DNA. You can also compare the amino acid types and ratios that are used and the protein structure that comes out of that. And what we found is that there's a universal genetic code, which we studied earlier, and DNA and RNA are essential parts of that. They don't have to be the way that they are, but because they are the way that they are, it's evidence that everything kind of has the same stuff in it, came from a common ancestor. And so they also compare common genes and what they do. One of those is involved in respiration. Cytochrome C is in lots and lots and lots of different organisms. In fact, I think we even mentioned it when we studied respiration. Anything that does cellular respiration has cytochrome C in it. Hemoglobin is another big one that lots of animals have, and it's responsible for gas exchange. And this is the millions of years ago along the bottom axis of this graph versus the nucleotide substitutions. And what this is showing is that closely related species have sequences that are more similar than distantly related species. So human cow have about the same number of base pair substitutions. There's dog and cow. These are comparisons. And so going back through DNA and proteins or molecular record of all the relationships. And so that's kind of the story on that. They can also compare the hemoglobin structure. Not everything has the hemoglobin structure. A lot of things have hemoglobin, but the structure of it differs in the different amino acid sequences. So this graph shows number of amino acid differences between hemoglobin of vertebrate species and that of humans. And so we've got amino acid differences from a human and a macaque. There's 8 different, 32 different from a dog to a bird, 45 different, 32 from a dog to a human, 45 to a bird to a human, 67 to 125. And so the comparing these amino acid sequences measures evolutionary relationship because the necessary chemicals are going to be the same for each thing. It's the things that are more closely related. If they've lost the need for a certain amino acid or amino acid set, then they're not as closely related. The study of building these family trees has a name. It's called phylogeny. And the closely related family species obviously will be on like the same branch of the tree, and the closer that they are, you can have lots of branches out, but the more intersections that you have between two species, the further away that they are. And Darwin himself has a famous little phylogeny here. It's kind of his scribbled notes, but this image has kind of become famous. And I don't even know what it says there, but he was trying to trace it back to basically one when he's talking about all these to A, B, C, D, and tracing their lineages back. He comes up with a single common ancestor there. And so we're coming back to the idea of artificial selection a little bit. All of these different artificial breeding things that we looked at tie into this idea of common ancestor, but it's used as its own evidence for evolution, so that's why it's stuck in here. But artificial breeding uses the variations to create different breeds and varieties and the descendants of the wolf. We talked a little bit about that. And we've been using this one. This is our brassica plant. and artificial breeding has come up with red cabbage and green cabbage and kale and broccoli and Brussels sprouts and cauliflower, and all of those are offshoots of the same wild plant. And so it goes back to that family tree thing. Natural selection is the mechanism by which evolution happens, and we can use it also as a evidence for evolution in and of itself. This is easier to use as an example, this insect thing, because they have pretty low or small lifespans. But this example is showing that when we kill something with insecticides, we kill off all of the ones that are susceptible to it, but once in a while there might be a gene or a chromosome that confers resistance. And if that one survives, then they end up passing that helpful mutation on to all of its offspring, which then become resistant also. So it's a classic example. Insecticide doesn't kill all the animals. Resistant ones are surviving and reproducing, and so it's inherited. And the insecticide becomes less and less effective. And this is seen all the time in agriculture and in industries related to insecticides. And it's a problem in the South right now with cotton and other crops that are grown in the South. They use a Roundup that is now, the weeds are becoming resistant to the Roundup, and so they're having to constantly escalate what they use. So those are kind of the different evidences and reasons we know evolution's happening. Couple other little things here to talk about, and one of them is convergent evolution. And this is fascinating because if you were to make a family tree out of all these things here, we'd see that they're not very closely related. So we're going to kind of look at why that is, and in between marsupials and mammals and other stuff. So we talked about anatomy earlier, and analogous structures refer to the evolution of different structures that do the same thing. They have a similar function, similar external appearance, but they have very different internal structures and development. And so we can see that they come from a very different origin. And it denotes that there's very little, if any, evolutionary relationship. And so it's basically a function of both of these things need to fly, or there's an advantage if they can fly, and so over time they both evolve to fly. But there's no evolutionary relationship, and so we can't be fooled by their appearance. Now, convergent evolution shows that this idea of things coming together in the analogous structures, 3 different animal groups evolved flight in different ways. The insects evolved it, and the birds evolved it. Can you think of another one?
Insects, birds,
Bats did, and mammals. Some mammals can fly. So do they have a recent common ancestor, all of these? And the answer to that is no, not particularly. You'll have a common ancestor with bats and humans before you'll have a common ancestor with bats and birds. So this is what we call convergent evolution. Things that do similar functions, but they didn't come from an immediate common ancestor. So evolved similar solution to similar problems, analogous structures again, same thing. Other examples of convergent evolution, you got fish that are aquatic vertebrates. There are other things that swim in the ocean. There are aquatic mammals, which are your dolphins and whales and things that like that. And they have similar adaptations to life in the sea, even though they do not have a relatively close common ancestor. The aerodynamics of swimming in the water are the same across all of the different groups that are in the water. The fins and sleek bodies are analogous structures. And then another little bit about evolution that we see is called parallel evolution. And the sugar glider of Australia and the flying squirrel of North America have evolved similar behaviors combined with adaptations. These are convergent evolution, what we call a common niche. And we haven't studied a niche, but a niche is a specific role in what something does or has to do to get food and survive. So, they fulfill similar ecological roles in similar environments, and so their adaptations ended up being similar. The sugar glider is actually only a few inches big, not very big at all. The flying squirrel is bigger, but both of them have these flaps that allow them to jump from tree to tree really easily. They're not closely related at all. A sugar glider is more closely related to a kangaroo and other marsupials than it is to any mammal. And so they evolved similar structures, similar abilities without a common ancestor. Marsupial mammals all have one common ancestor to one another, and placental mammals all have one common ancestor to one another, and yet we have all of these different niches that they have fulfilled. They're closely related to each other vertically here than they are horizontally. You got two different types of moles, and they're called mole not because they're related closely, but because they fulfill similar roles in their environment. The anteater versus the numbat, and the nocturnal insectivores, which are the mouse versus the marsupial mouse, and they tend to look a lot alike, but again, more closely related vertically than horizontally. Climbers, the lemurs and the spotted cuscus, the gliders, sugar glider and flying squirrel, and the ocelot versus Tasmanian cat, chasing predator, Tasmanian wolf, and the wolf. So these are different niches that they fulfill. It's kind of neat. Couple of things to tie this all together. Theodosius Dobzhansky is a famous evolutionary biologist, and he has the quote that's often repeated: "Nothing in biology makes sense except in light of evolution." And that's really true, as evolution covers everything that biologists do. And once we have a really good sense of how evolution is occurring, everything makes more sense. Another famous evolutionary biologist, Ernst Mayr, said evolution is so overwhelmingly established that it has become irrational to call it a theory. And when we move beyond a theory, we start talking about descriptions of patterns in nature, and those being law in the natural world. And that's, some people say that that's what evolution is, and I would tend to agree in many respects. Now, Darwin did not, he obviously had critics and still does. So just talking about the controversy to wrap things up, Darwin's critics, evolution is nearly universally accepted by biologists. The source of controversy, or evolution as a source of controversy, it's there for some. Religious groups and things like that tend to get all up in arms about it. And they have 7 principal objections. And this part, we're going to go through them just really quick and talk about how you would answer those as a evolutionary biologist. They say evolution is not solidly demonstrated, and we use the word theory when we talk about evolution, and the common usage of the word theory is sometimes works to its disadvantage, because the layperson thinks theory is just a theory and it means it's not really true. But it is a theory. It's a theory just like the theory of gravity, which is to say that things fall down. We know they fall down. It's happening all the time, and so is evolution. Okay. There are some critics that say there are no fossil intermediates. That is simply no longer true. Many, many, many intermediates have been found since Darwin's time. Some that he predicted himself would be found have been found. Intelligent design proponents, they really, they say one of the things is that it's too complex for a random process, that things don't evolve because how on earth can we go from a single-celled organism to these complex organisms? But natural selection's not a random process. It's directed, or it's not directed by any guiding hand that we can see. A lack of a guiding hand is enough to explain what we have seen. It doesn't mean that there isn't a God. It just means that we can explain what we see through nature. We don't need any sort of intelligent designer to explain what we see. Some say, this is an interesting one, evolution violates the second law of thermodynamics. Second law of thermodynamics is the entropy law, where things become more and more disorganized. And if you think about that, it might have a little bit of, it might make a little bit of sense to say, well, if life is becoming more and more organized, then that violates the second law of thermodynamics, that things should become more disorganized. The answer to that is that the Earth is not a closed system. And if it were a closed system, things would become disorganized, but energy is constantly being put into the system from the sun. And so that means that we're not violating the second law at all. Proteins are too improbable to have come about on their own. The probability of hemoglobin as a random event forming because of all of the different proteins and things, or different amino acids and things involved, is 1/20, and that's, the amino acids to the 141st power. That's the probability of it spontaneously coming together as a molecule. And the answer here is that you can't argue it backwards. What are the odds of students having the birthdays that they do in class just because they you can't argue that it's improbable that they'll have that birthday. They do have that birthday, so it's a logical fallacy. And then 6 and 7 here. Natural selection does not imply evolution. No scientist has evolved a fish into a frog. Artificial selection has produced differences more distinctive than those between wild species that we see. We have actually done this. And this one is really an interesting one, the irreducible complexity argument. Irreducible complexity says that the intricate machinery of a cell can't be explained by evolution from simpler stages. And there's some, if any of it holds water, I think some of this is really interesting. Because we have the proton pump, if you remember back in photosynthesis and respiration, the proton pump, putting ATP together and splitting it, or by pumping the protons across a gradient, is a really complex little piece of machinery. And so this is the kind of thing that they're talking about. It's too complex to build out of these simpler pieces. But natural selection can act on a complex system because at every stage of its evolution, the system functions, little pieces get added onto, and we're talking about billions of years of evolution here. So that's, tricky on that end, but still. That's it. That's the end of chapter 21.